Declassified documents reveal a space-based military program.
The military hasn't yet said what they want to do with it. They haven't said anything is ruled in or ruled out.
One dedicated to the weaponization of space.
The way I look at it is I'm not militarizing space. I'm parking cargo.
And a top-secret mission currently in orbit.
So we may have just seen a black file.
And nobody knows exactly what it's doing up there.
098 firm, we have splash. Stand by for PDA.
Every year, more than $90 billion is allocated to clandestine government programs, collectively called the Black Budget. Each individual operation is a black file.
I'm Mike Baker. As a covert CIA operations officer for over a decade and a half,
I supervised missions around the globe. My security clearances gave me access to many classified projects. Now, I'm following the money trail to the secrets hidden inside the black files. San Diego, California, March 2018. A presidential speech to the Marines at Miramar Air Base announces the creation of a U.S. Space Force, a sixth branch of the military. The pronouncement leaves many puzzled. What is the Space Force? Is it the militarization of space with lunar bases? Will it involve high-tech weapons fighting intergalactic battles across our solar system?
if I know anything about the government, the president's announcement is based on plans that have been in the works for decades. Those plans are right here, hidden in various black budget line items as top-secret military research dedicated to the weaponization of space. They indicate that the Space Force exists as a $10 billion a year military space program. To confirm my suspicions, I reached out to space historian Amy Shira Teitel. She says that recently declassified documents indicate that I'm on the right track.
I have some really interesting pictures here, but I think I want to start with this one.
You are looking at proof that somebody found a spacesuit, the type of which we've never seen, just sitting in a trunk somewhere at Kennedy Space Center. It doesn't look like anything we've ever seen because it's not a NASA spacesuit.
President Eisenhower created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to oversee the non-military exploration and research of space. It was to be civilian-oriented, encouraging peaceful applications. That orientation quickly changed.
The NASA suits were white.
Yeah, they were white, they were silver earlier on. We never had a blue one. This is actually a US Air Force spacesuit from the 60s.
This is potential evidence of a military space program from the mid-60s.
Yes.
So who was involved? Tell me about the people who would have been wearing these uniforms.
There were 7 astronauts selected by the US Air Force who would have been wearing these suits, and they would have worn them flying up to stay in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. That's what this program was called, or MOL for short. The lab was actually a spy platform in orbit that the Air Force was planning to use to check out the Soviet Union from space.
Publicly, MOL's goal was to determine military uses for humans in space. But its actual classified mission was to put a crewed surveillance station into orbit to spy on the Soviet Union. 2 astronauts would be launched on 40-day missions using a state-of-the-art camera system and side-looking airborne radar. There were living quarters and a compartment for conducting experiments.
So, Amy, how long did this program, the MOL, stay classified?
It was only in 2015 that the National Reconnaissance Organization declassified the documents about MOL.
That's incredible. 1963 or so until 2015.
Yes.
What was the budget? Do we know what the black budget was for the MOL?
It was somewhere in the order of $1.5 billion. In 1960s dollars. So with inflation, that's about $10 billion by today's standard. If this stuff was classified from 63 to 2015, you can only imagine what technologies they were keeping guarded.
Amy's right. US government records are automatically declassified after 25 years, unless their release is deemed a threat to national security or diplomatic relations. This early incarnation of a Space Force was classified for 52 years.
If we fast forward to now, what do you imagine the next generation of space satellites to look like, to be capable of?
The optics on MOL, for example, were supposed to be good enough to resolve things the size of a softball from orbit. So if that's declassified, that means there's the next generation of better technology. I mean, this is technology that will be able to tell the color of your eyes from space.
Amy's evidence cements a connection between the Air Force and the beginnings of a Space Force, complete with plans for the future. But just how far did they get with putting soldiers in space? And why did the program end? Or did it? I'm on my way to a remote location in the Mojave Desert to speak with a very rare type of expert, a space archaeologist named Peter Merlin. He says he's found hard evidence of soldiers in space.
This is the crash site of the No. 3 X-15, a hypersonic rocket-powered research aircraft designed to fly to the edge of space.
The X-15 was part of the X-plane series of experimental aircraft designed by the U.S. Air Force and NASA. Powered by liquid propellant rocket engines, the X-15 reached Mach 6.7, or 4,500 miles per hour, a world record that still stands. Over 199 flights, it gathered valuable data and reached the edge of space. For all its achievements, it will also be forever linked to its one failed flight.
This is exactly where the forward fuselage ended up, right here.
What happened? Give me the details.
In November 1967, U.S. Air Force Major Michael J. Adams was flying the X-15 on a research flight. It was a high-altitude mission. He was trying to fly the plane and do experiments at the same time. He became task-saturated, apparently enough distracted to miss a switch on the panel. He ended up putting the plane into a slow spin, and at hypersonic speeds, that was really serious. The aircraft entered an inverted dive. Eventually, at 62,000 feet, the vehicle just broke apart.
So 25 years after the crash, you identify the crash site, you come out here, and there are still pieces of the debris field?
Absolutely.
And what did you find?
We found quite a few pieces, actually. Pieces of structure, the skin, parts of the tail surfaces. In fact, I've got one with me that I can show you.
You found this?
You'd be surprised at the stuff I found. There was a lot of big material out in the debris field. This is part of one of the horizontal stabilizers.
That's amazing.
Peter's find is concrete evidence of the materials and design of one of the government's most advanced craft, a platform that was a key step in paving the way for our permanent presence in space.
Was it purely a military program?
Military has always been a part of space. The Army was particularly interested in establishing a permanent manned lunar settlement under Project Horizon. But the scientists were more interested in developing spacecraft that could go to the moon or even to permanent space stations in orbit.
So a lunar base, in a sense.
There was definitely talk about a lunar base.
So the U.S. Air Force had plans for planes in space and orbital space stations, even a base on the moon. Yet outside of the X-plane series, most of these ideas were abandoned. Or were they? Could the current Space Force include space planes and lunar bases manned by space troops?
Like many of the black files, secrets are revealed by poring over the smallest detail in government documents. A reliable source tells me that he's done just that and has found one unredacted word in a recently declassified paper that points to a previously unknown space weapon.
Recently declassified documents reveal that a military program designed to weaponize space started in the 1960s and continues today.
Ben McGee is a good friend and old source who happens to be an interdisciplinary scientist. What that means is he can connect the dots better than most. He's been poring over a stack of recently declassified documents, and he found a one-word clue that's got him very excited. Now, all he would tell me is that one word, saint. Okay, Ben, I'll bite. What's saint?
Saint is something that I found while I was poking through recently declassified documents on the Manned Orbital Laboratory. Some of the things are still redacted today. But then I came across this mention of the word saint. Whatever it was on this manned orbiting laboratory is still redacted. Well, what the heck is saint? So I went on a deep dive. I ended up having to go to Air Force documents from the same year, and I found it. Saint stands for Satellite Inspector.
Satellite Inspector.
Sounds mundane, right?
Saint, right. I mean, is that inspecting our satellites? Isn't it?
It would examine unidentified objects in space, determine their characteristics. I go to the closure document for the small program. One of the missions, inspection and destruction of hostile satellites.
Destroying satellites using ASAT or anti-satellite technology is considered a defensive rather than offensive weapon.
Say the Russians say they put up a weather satellite. This is our ability to go and say, is it a weather satellite or is there a nuke on board and they haven't told anybody?
Covertly, obviously.
Yes, because this was from the National Reconnaissance Office, which is again, a clandestine office.
The National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO, works alongside my old outfit building and deploying spy satellites.
Are you saying that part of that or all of it is still operational?
Well, that's the thing that really got me, because this was declassified in 2015, right? This is half a century old stuff. So what idea in Saint is so good that it has to still be classified today? There's only one reason. It's if some part of it is a component of active war planning documents. So this means that some part of Saint has to be alive today.
So Saint could be an active black file ASAT project with technology to identify and destroy enemy satellites.
How difficult is that process?
In a way, it's all about timing. Imagine this is a satellite, and I'm going to have this orbit around us.
Okay, and this is the
That would be your
missile.
Your enemy missile.
Okay, so I see what you're talking about. This is, I mean, this makes sense, right?
It's predictable.
It's coming around. I can kind of I start to get the rhythm. So if that's a satellite and this is the missile,
you got it.
The odds of me actually hitting this thing now with tossing this ball is probably going to be minimal.
Yep.
Keep it spinning.
Yep. Let's back just a little bit, yeah. Yes! You just knocked the satellite out of the sky.
Look at that.
You were able to do that using your reflexes. Well, the world has supercomputers all over the place. So that kind of timing is getting easier and easier. You know, my opinion, the threat to everything we have out in space is only going up. It's not going down.
The idea that ASAT technology could lead to more conflict isn't far off. ASAT missiles were first conceived as surface-to-air, at least publicly. In fact, they were the reason that the U.S. entered the Outer Space Treaty, created in the late 1960s to keep space weapons free. Now, are they the impetus for a space force? And is SAINT a top-secret technology within our defenses? Well, I'm near Edwards Air Force Base, as near as I can get without drawing unwanted attention from their security team. In 1986, the culmination of a 6-year ASAT mission was launched from here, Operation Celestial Eagle. Now, to learn more about today's ASAT technology, I'm going to meet with the only man who successfully shot down a satellite. General,
Mike,
you're planning for, about to engage in what could be considered one of the first military acts of a space force.
well, that's true. It was the beginning of combat in space by manned airplanes. The ASAT program was intended to counter what the Soviets were doing at the time. Our task was to develop a weapon that could be carried on a fighter, an F-15 specifically, and launch it, and it would go into low orbit space and detect and intercept the target satellite. It was a development between multiple companies and the United States Air Force, a lot of work done in the black world, and Friday the 13th, it all came together. I had clearance from the command center to launch, final clearance, and I launched going through about 35,000 feet.
And what did you think was going to happen?
Nobody really knew. Would a very high velocity object just simply punch a hole in it? Or would it hit it and cause it to explode? Or what? I could see it as it launched. I rolled over, inverted, and looked at it as the missile fired in the first stage, and then it went out of sight. I didn't know exactly what happened, but I really wanted to.
Did you have to wait till you got back to Edwards?
Well, no. I make a radio call, Vandy Control, Eddie 01 leveling off at 30,000 feet. All I could hear in the background was this cheering and laughing and applauding and everything, so I immediately knew we had hit it.
How did you feel?
That was wonderful.
Where do you think we are now?
Interesting question. I'm not sure I know the complete answer. I'm absolutely confident the United States military is prepared to defend our satellites. There are technologies available today that were not available in the 80s, and there are probably more sophisticated ways today.
When you hear the current administration talking about establishing a sixth branch of the military, a space force, do you kind of have in the back of your mind a thought like, been there, done that?
Not exactly, but I'm glad to have been a part of it in the beginning because we need to do that. I'm an advocate of the Space Force today. I knew, as others knew, we had to develop weapons that could defeat our enemy in space. So we had to do this.
General Pearson believes that defense is driving our need to create a space force with offensive capabilities. So what is some of the newest technology? Well, the answer involves Star Wars and the biggest space plane on Earth. Top secret technology used to protect our space-based assets, satellites, is a driving mission behind Space Force, past and present. But how is that black budget funded technology getting into space in the first place? Washington, D.C. I'm at the Spy Museum, meeting up with military veteran and historian Vince Houghton. He says the answer is in plain sight. Vince.
Mike.
How you doing, man?
Nice to meet you.
I spent a lot of time in the CIA, so I get that overlap between civilian and military programs. But you're saying there were some space shuttle missions that were covert.
What people don't quite understand is just even the design of this space shuttle was heavily influenced by intelligence and military purposes. This stuff is so highly classified that we're now decades separated from these events taking place, and we still don't know what the space shuttle put up there in space.
4, 3, 2, 1, ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery, the first flight totally dedicated to Department of Defense mission.
One of its operations was to launch a Hubble, to look at the cosmos and look at the stars, but also in its payload it might have had a signals intelligence satellite or an imagery intelligence satellite to do intel work or to do military communication systems up in space.
Obviously, the intelligence community, the military community saw the advantages. I mean, a big, big payload, right? I mean, there's an opportunity there for a lot of activity.
Well, that's the key behind this space shuttle. It had a huge amount of payload it could lift up into space. And then some of these signals intelligence satellites had massive radio antennas the size of football fields. So you needed a big, huge payload like the space shuttle had.
About the same time the space shuttle was starting up, there was a tremendous amount of interest in space for military purposes, particularly from the Reagan administration, right? The first manned space shuttle took flight in 1981. 2 years later, President Ronald Reagan announces the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, a program designed to shoot down satellites and ballistic missiles.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
What can you tell me about SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and
its involvement with the shuttle program.
Shooting down Soviet missiles from space depended on putting a constellation of satellites into orbit, some of them to detect missile launches. Others were to track the missiles in the flight. You actually have to lock in on that target.
If we utilize the extraordinary capabilities of the space shuttle, America, for the first time, will be able to defend herself against a Soviet missile attack.
SDI, or Star Wars, ended after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but by 2002, it was back as the Missile Defense Agency, focusing on such exotic-sounding programs as the airborne laser and other high-energy physics-based technologies. Now, the shuttle program obviously ended, but clearly the Air Force interest, military interest in space, didn't stop. Where do you think the military is currently in the use of space?
Space is a key component in all of our military and national security operations. We could not exist as a nation without it. From early warning, which has been a key component of space since the 1950s and 60s, to communications, to navigation, to the GPS systems up in space. All these things were designed for military and national security purposes.
Is it possible that the space shuttle positioned spy satellites and the technology to protect them in outer space? And is a modern version of Star Wars being deployed now as part of the current Blackfile Space Force? I asked Ben McGee. He's still investigating the technology behind Saint. He told me to meet him in a remote location. He's got something important to show me. All right, Ben, you dragged me out here to what appears to be the middle of nowhere. What exactly is it that you got us doing?
Keep your eye right about there.
Right there, right?
Yeah, I mean, fan out a little bit. So we're looking for what looks like a star, moving steadily up and to the right.
Wait, that?
Yeah. You got it. Yeah.
An airplane?
So,
No,
right.
no, not an airplane.
So, it's a satellite.
Satellite. That's remarkably bright.
But not just any satellite. Well, see, it's fading right now?
Yeah.
It's not in the sunlight long, so that's why we're here right now. That object right there does not show up in any publicly accessible NORAD registry for satellites, but you just saw it right there.
The U.S. government detects, tracks, and catalogs all objects orbiting Earth, including anything we put into space. Those records are all available online, unless, of course, they're part of a classified mission. So that's not cataloged in the normal places for unclassified satellites?
Correct.
All right, so, correct me if I'm wrong. It's not cataloged.
Yep.
So we may have just seen a black file.
You got it.
Ben McGee is showing me what he believes to be a Space Force black file project flying across the night sky. So that's not cataloged in the normal places for unclassified satellites?
Correct.
So we may have just seen a black file.
You got it.
But how can he be certain?
All right, so this is a long exposure, and you see the track right here. This is actually the satellite streak.
Okay.
And you see it starts off dim,
Yeah.
goes bright as it goes into full sunlight, and then back out again.
We used a DSLR camera and put it on long exposure so we can see the object as it moves over time. So you can track it.
Yeah,
You can
well,
see.
visually track it, and now we know its bearing.
So we got speed.
If you know all of these things, basically its orientation, its speed, timing, you play that backwards, and you could look for if it lines up over any known launches.
So you reverse engineer it.
You got
basically.
it. You play it backwards.
And then you match it to whatever you've got in terms of launches.
Yep. And all those are out in the open. It's hard to hide a launch. This happens to cross right over a launch from the Cape on September 7th, 2017.
Cape Canaveral?
Cape Canaveral,
Okay.
yeah. That was on a SpaceX Falcon. It's a commercial rocket. But we know what that launch was. It was the Air Force's space plane.
Since NASA retired the space shuttle, the U.S. Air Force conscripted a new space plane called the X-37B.
Wait a minute, you're telling me that what we just saw up there is the X-37B?
You got it, on its 5th mission, right there in the sky.
The first person to discover the X-37B in orbit was Dutch astronomer Marco Langbroek, who regularly tracks classified objects. He confirmed the altitude relative to the space station and saw the object actively maneuver, meaning it could not be space junk.
The X-37B that we just saw has been up there for over a year now.
And nobody knows exactly what it's doing up there. And I like to stress that the world's only space plane that's flying right now is owned by the Air Force.
It's the Space Force in action.
Well, in a way, yes. And let me tell you, I actually watched this program go black.
But what do you mean you saw it go black?
Well, so I was tracking this stuff. The X-34, the X-37, and the X-38 were all being developed at the same time at NASA Dryden Research Center. They were all test modules for the next generation of space shuttles. So, I mean, I was tuning in regularly and
tracking progress.
It was cool stuff.
Yeah.
And suddenly, one day in 2004, I pull up the website again, and everything on the X-37 is gone. At first I thought, well, is the website down? But no, everything else was up. It had just been scrubbed. Several years later, all of a sudden, the X-37B is flying for the Air Force.
3, 2, 1, ignition. And liftoff.
It went from NASA control to DARPA, and then shortly thereafter to the Air Force.
You got it.
Being pushed into a black file.
Yes.
It's a black file in action, which is incredibly rewarding because so much of our effort so far, right, you bump up against these dead ends or you just can't get any further, you feel.
Yeah.
But that's visual confirmation. And it's also exciting because it shows that, in a way, the Space Force exists.
It's already flying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Mike.
We can see the X-37B, but we don't know what it's doing. Is it deploying more satellites, setting up a Star Wars defense-like system, or something else? I'm meeting with a longtime Black Files investigator to learn what he's uncovered. John.
Hey, Mike.
The X-37B.
Yeah.
Now, you've spent a lot of time filing Freedom of Information Act requests.
I've tried to.
Tried to.
It's a highly secretive program that they don't want to talk about. And in fact, the responses have been very few and far between.
Is this some of what we're looking at here?
Well, the very little that has come in. I can tell you, this confirms that it is a United States Air Force at this point program, that this shows if there is information, it's the Air Force that'll give it to us.
But they're not denying the existence of the program.
No, it's there. And they'll tell you it's there, but they won't tell you why it's there.
What's the budget line for this black file?
At this point, we just don't know. They're not talking to you about what's the payload. We know that it goes up, we know that it comes down, but what happens in between in the year, 2 years that it's up there, your guess is as good as mine.
What's the function of it?
We know that it is trying to develop and test and implement reusable space technology. So putting something up there that can come back and we can reuse it again. That's the public line.
Officially, the X-37B is conducting experiments in space in areas like electronics and mechanical functions to see how they deal with the long-term effects of being in space. Speculatively, those experiments could also include anything from weapons to propulsion drives.
It's kind of a known formula that generally the military is about 50 years behind telling you what they're really capable of.
50 years?
Oh, roughly, yeah. Okay. I mean, look at the development of the B-2 stealth bomber and planes and aircraft like it. And so now that we know about the X-37B, the capabilities of it and what they are trying to do or what they've already done is anybody's guess.
Is the X-37B carrying out missions for a future Space Force? The government is going to stay tight-lipped. But I've gotten a hold of a key insider, a general who oversaw the Air Force's global air operations and now has his sights set on the key goal of Space Force, the militarization of space. Using recently declassified files, we've tracked down an active black-budget Space Force project currently orbiting Earth, the X-37B. We don't know its exact mission, but given it's a reusable platform, it's certainly possible that it's transporting some sort of technology into space. To help me learn more about the militarization of space, the goal of the Space Force Black File, I've turned to a key insider, Air Force General Carlton Everhart. As head of the Air Mobility Command, he's responsible for mobilization and air response anywhere on Earth. General.
Mike, how are you doing?
Doing well. Good to see you too. There's some fascinating media coverage out there about the use of space for military logistics.
We were looking at ways to be able to get around the globe faster than the way we do it now. Our normal methodology of either doing it by lift, i.e. aircraft, or doing it by ships. When it comes to airlift, that's fast, but not much volume. When it comes to sea lift, that's slow, but a tremendous amount of volume. Could we meet something in between to get us there faster? Load up our cargo on rockets, go to a suborbital flight, and then come down to another side on a point of the globe in about 30 minutes. It helps them be able to execute faster. It helps it to be unpredictable. It helps us be able to go to any point of the globe.
So you're really talking about on-time delivery?
Exactly.
Of just anything that's needed by the combatants?
Whether it was beans, bullets, ammunition.
The X-37B is staying in orbit for extended periods, so on-time delivery is clearly not its mission.
Another method is to actually park things in space using a orbital barge. In other words, pre-position a lot of cargo in space and bring it down when it needs to be called forward at a point.
Sounds to me like the general is talking about parking not just ammunition, but weapons. What about pushback regarding the idea of militarizing space?
Well, the way I look at it is I'm not militarizing space. I'm parking cargo. Yeah, is it weapons that could be used? Yeah, but it's used on Mother Earth. It's not used in space. All I'm doing is bringing it up, parking it, and bringing it back down.
Do you think that the military is already pursuing this?
You know, we're already using a Space Force. We're already bringing that concept about. We want to be able to use that space media to our advantage of all platforms.
So if we don't do it, some other nation, likely not with our best interest at heart, is pursuing it.
You don't think they are? Absolutely. Because they want to be there first. And if they can get there first, then they have the advantage.
General, I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Everhart's view is intriguing. Small rockets, or even clandestine ships like the X-37B, could be putting into place the elements of a space force, or at the very least, assisting with Earth-based battlefields. But the military isn't doing this alone. As my investigation shows, the partnership between the military and civilian companies is long-standing. I'm heading to Long Beach, California, home to one of the biggest companies in that partnership, Virgin Orbit. General Everhart has been there to discuss potential collaborations with the military. They've told me they won't speak about military cargo in space, but I'm determined to get a behind-the-scenes look at their operations.
Well, welcome to Virgin Orbit.
Dan, thank you very much. I gotta tell you, I've been to a lot of places in my life. I've never been to a rocket factory before.
Well, we're a busy shop here.
What's your mission?
Our mission is to put into orbit a whole new array of small satellites that are being developed commercially as well as by governments.
Smaller platforms include 22-pound microsatellites and nanosatellites, weighing in at a pound or less. They're used for communications, to inspect other satellites, and as spycraft. You're the delivery mechanism for those satellites.
Exactly. We're Federal Express to orbit.
Okay, and how are you doing that?
We're doing that by building a small rocket and putting it under the wing of a 747, taking it to 35,000 feet, dropping it off, and flying to orbit.
This is the payload area.
This is the payload area right here. And so you can see we can hold anything from a lot of small satellites up to a satellite maybe the size of an industrial refrigerator.
That payload reminds me of what Vince Houghton said about the space shuttle. The military needs craft that can transport big payloads. Now with these smaller satellites, Virgin can handle the workload.
So this is our integration area. And so behind us here is our first orbital rocket.
How much interest does the military have in what you're doing?
Quite a bit. These new satellites provide a whole different operating strategy for national security. The idea of getting to space quickly, getting to space from anywhere, so that you're not just sitting in one place and launching satellites, and being able to affordably get mission capabilities up or quickly replace mission capabilities if they're disabled is a huge importance to national security.
How many are being built right now?
We have 5 on the floor. We've got a couple of test articles up in the desert.
With all that accessibility,
opening up space.
Opening up space. Any concern that with that increased accessibility, we may be leading towards a possibility of space warfare, more military use of space?
If the U.S. military, for instance, has the capability to put up a satellite within a day if it loses one, who's going to put in the investment to take the opportunity to mess with it? You know, it's important to keep in mind that space assets for military use have been coming along steadily through the last decade. So they've been there, and there's been a large activity. There's Air Force Space Command today. So an evolution into a larger focus of that isn't a big surprise.
My visit to Virgin Orbit makes me even more curious. What could the technology behind Saint be? Is it new spy tech, satellite defenses, or an offensive weapon? One thing is for certain, there will be a Space Force utilizing the latest technologies to protect our space-based assets. But I wonder what those futuristic weapons will look like. As I began looking into the technology and plans for a U.S. Space Force, another country announced theirs. France is spending $4 billion on ASATs armed with lasers to dazzle or destroy enemy satellites, machine guns to fire at any perceived threat, and fleets of nano-satellites to protect larger recon and communication satellites. How similar are France's plans to our own? And with the U.S. spending $10 billion annually on covert space programs, what will our Space Force look like? To find out, I'm going to speak with Patrick Tucker, a journalist and author who specializes in writing about the intersection of emerging technologies and national security. Patrick.
Hey.
Hey, Patrick. When we're talking about building out a Space Force, are any of these projects, are any of them sort of advanced development moving forward from, say, back in the mid-'80s, Operation Celestial Eagle as an example?
The military is looking at a research program that's looking at a few different things. One of them is putting a directed energy weapon, that's a laser, on an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. The hope being that that stealth fighter is going to get into the range of an enemy missile launch, and as the missile is lifting off, the jet would use its laser to destroy the missile as it's hurtling towards the atmosphere.
30 years ago, General Pearson shot down a satellite with a missile from an F-15. Now, the pilot of an F-35 will be doing the same, but with lasers.
The Missile Defense Agency is also looking at a program originally tried in the 1990s to put a neutral particle beam in space. That's basically a ray gun. It also works with the electromagnetic spectrum, sort of like a laser, but the photons aren't moving at the speed of light. Instead, you're working with subatomic particles that are moving slightly slower.
In outer space, a particle beam would be more effective than a laser because the subatomic particles could penetrate a missile or satellite versus a laser, which would only burn the surface.
The prototypes that the military was looking at in the 1980s and early 1990s were incredibly large. We're talking about things at the size of a football field that you would have to launch into space. It was incredibly impractical. But today they believe, because of advances in information technology, miniaturization, you can put a neutral particle beam in space that can perform better and be much smaller.
Okay, so we're well beyond sort of the theoretical discussion about the weaponizing of space.
That's what the Pentagon believes, yes.
One of the fascinating developments seems to be the X-37B. Talk to me about that. What do you think it's doing up there?
Well, it could be doing a wide variety of things. Right now, mostly experimentation to see how long it can stay up there, what the comms are like, et cetera, et cetera. But potentially what it allows is for a persistent presence in space for the US military. In theory, you could outfit such an airplane, again, with either lasers or missiles, and then have it be in a constant orbit, which would allow it to potentially strike anywhere in the world at a moment's notice.
That's a little bit of a playoff of retired General Everhart's comments about parking cargo and other logistics up in space.
The military hasn't yet said what they want to do with it. They haven't said anything is ruled in or ruled out. But if you have a persistent presence in space, potentially such a plane could carry a small crew, including perhaps a advanced strike team that could be put down on Earth in any particular spot at a moment's notice. It's a rather elaborate potential use of such a plane. It's not something that the Pentagon has said that they definitely want to do with it, but a plane such as that would have that potential use.
In all your investigative work and your research as a journalist covering this issue, to what degree are you seeing any efforts by the big three, Russia, China, the US, to start talking about a new treaty or some type of new agreement as to what we're actually going to end up doing up there in space?
Right now, that doesn't look particularly hopeful. There is an agreement called the New START Treaty that does govern nuclear weapons, and specifically their number. But the problem is that that treaty doesn't actually cover any of the newer types of weapons that we're talking about. In terms of a new space treaty, this seems rather far away.
The president's announcement that he wants to create a sixth branch of the military was big news. But as we've learned, black budgets have been funding military space black files for decades. Seeing what incredible craft and weaponry are being developed as the Space Force advances, I'm convinced we'll be discovering many more black files in the future.